What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back to the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube for the latest episode of Broncos Now. Team reporter and host Sydney Jones here, coming to you from Indianapolis at the NFL Scouting Combine. On today's show, we'll take a look at some of the top storylines surrounding head coach Sean Payton and general manager George Paton's press conferences. All that and more coming up. On Tuesday, head coach Sean Payton spoke to the media at the NFL Combine for the first time in his 16-year head coaching career. He talked about assembling his coaching staff and what the process was like.
Parcells wanted to be around younger coaches. He talked about it all the time, and so I like being around younger coaches now. I mean, I still consider myself a younger coach, but then, I sit in the room and listen to these young coaches that I enjoy. You get energized. And then there's some experience, and there's just a little bit of everything. And there wasn't any design. I think it was just finding the best people. So Bo was brought up, Dan Dalrymple in the strength conditioning. We've got another hire we're going to make over there. But each step of the way, there's been a vision as to what does this ingredient bring to the recipe. And I can say that. And I think that's the unique thing of putting together a staff. Of really trying to anticipate how the room will interact. Greg Minuski, you guys will have a chance to get around these guys. He himself has got a unique personality and someone that I was drawn to. He's got experience, he's played, and I think that anywhere he's been, his players have spoken highly of him. So. So there's a lot of thought that way as to how it all comes together.
And head coach Sean Payton talked about how he'll look to establish a positive and winning culture here with the Broncos.
Beyond people, it's every detail. Every little thing matters. In almost an obsessive way that because all of those details matter inside the framework of the field, and we obsess as coaches and teachers on doing the little things well, but that has to exist in every other area of your building, and in your equipment room, in your training room, in your cafeteria, and pretty soon then, the building all moves in a direction kind of in concert, and that's pretty cool when that happens. It's not easy. People talk about it, they search for it like the Holy Grail a little bit. But I've seen it, I've been a part of it, and it requires a little bit of unselfishness from all of us in knowing that if we're all moving in this one direction, chances are it's going to benefit all of us that are moving.
General Manager George Paton also spoke to the media at the NFL Combine on Tuesday and talked about what this week will look like for him and his staff, how it's been working with head coach Sean Payton, and more.
Always look forward to coming to Indy. Seeing the players, compete in a less than natural, uncomfortable environment, and it's really good for our scouts and our coaches to spend as much time as we can around these players so we can make the best possible decision moving forward. It's been a busy month. Obviously, I've really enjoyed working side by side with Sean, and I thought, we have good chemistry together, a lot of collaboration. Since we made the trade, we've been off and running, and Sean, putting his staff together, and we've been in draft meetings, free agent prep, so a lot going on in a short time. I think we've accomplished a lot, but we have a long way to go. Couldn't be more impressed with Sean and the staff he put together. I know he's got a few more hires, but he's been methodical throughout the process. His attention to detail. He had a vision for what he's looking for, and I felt he hired a really good staff, and so. Be good with the new coaches to get with the scouts this week, talk players. The more we can talk and collaborate, the better decisions we will make. And so this will be a real productive week for us. We get back, we'll get into more free agent meetings with the coaches. So look forward to having a good week.
George Paton also talked about the team's needs, specifically the talent on the offensive line and in the running backs room, and how he'll look to address that this offseason.
Yeah, we need to upgrade at the offensive line. We do expect Garrett to be healthy. There's a lot of different ways to acquire any position, free agency, the draft, It just kind of depends what's stronger. Is it free agency stronger or is the draft stronger? And obviously we need to upgrade there in the offensive line. I mean, we ended up, I don't know how many backs played. I look at my depth chart, we have like 9 running backs. So we obviously we had a lot of injuries there. Javonte, we feel will be healthy. We need to add. We're high on some of the guys that are up, some of the free agents. We do have Chase Edmonds coming back, but we do need to add at that position.
Plus, George gave an update on running back Javonte Williams and wide receiver Tim Patrick.
I think he's on track. I don't want to put a date on it, but he's out there jogging. He's working his butt off. He's rehabbing, and Javonte, they anticipate he would be ready for the start of the season. Yeah, that was a huge loss. You can argue one of the biggest losses of the season. When he got hurt that day, the whole building was deflated. You guys know Tim, what he brings every day. The leader, really good player. He's running now. He's jogging. We anticipate him. I don't know where he'll be back in terms of the off-season programs, but next season certainly he'll be 100%.
Now joining me here inside the Indiana Convention Center is Broncos lead writer Aric DiLalla. Aric, nice to be here in Indy. Thanks for joining the show today.
Yeah, of course. A lot of action going on behind us.
Yes, of course. And this is also where we heard from head coach Sean Payton and general manager George Paton today. Aric, starting with Sean Payton's press conference, what was your biggest takeaway?
Yeah, I think 2 things. One, just talking about putting the coaching staff together. Everything was done intentionally. There was a vision in mind in terms of how everybody fit together. How is everyone's going to work in the room, how they're going to help these players achieve their potential. So that stood out to me. Obviously, that's what you'd expect from an experienced head coach. And then secondly, talking about Russell Wilson, he said, at some point, we're going to have to take the rear view mirror, the side view mirror. He kind of said, I'm not really sure which one this is, but at some point you have to take that off and just look forward. And then we know last year was not as successful as the Broncos would have liked it to be, as Russell Wilson would have liked it to be. But at some point you got to move forward. Certainly the Broncos, George Paton said the same thing. They're ready to move forward.
Yeah. He talked a lot about his coaching staff too, Aric. And, the team announced, several of those hires over the weekend, but, they haven't hired everyone yet. He's still got a couple roles to fill.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he mentioned a quality control coach on offense, several different spots on defense. I think he mentioned a strength and conditioning coach as well. So there are still spots to fill. This is not a finalized coaching staff. Important to note that. Even a guy like Matt Patricia, who interviewed for the Broncos defensive coordinator job, Sean Payton said he would meet with him this week in Indianapolis. He would talk to him about a potential role in Denver. Didn't guarantee that it would happen, but also didn't rule it out. That's something he would talk about with Vance Joseph. And speaking of Vance Joseph, Sydney, it wasn't necessarily his time as a head coach that stood out to Sean Payton. It was working in Arizona, which Sean Payton kind of spoke about being a tough situation. The defense was still pretty good there, especially 2 and 3 years ago. So that stood out to him as he made the hire of Vance for defensive coordinator.
Well, Sean Payton, he did retain 2 coaches from the previous staff in Denver, defensive backs coach Christian Parker and defensive line coach Marcus Dixon. What do you think impressed Coach about them?
Yeah, they're young guys. Obviously, Christian Parker a little bit more experienced than Marcus Dixon, but their units performed well. And I thought, it's kind of like players. You don't want to let young talent get away. Sean Payton talked about that. And it's one thing to say that. I think what really stood out to me is he said when they were doing the second round of defensive coordinator interviews, Marcus Dixon and Christian Parker were in the room. And so that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah,
interesting, obviously, to get their perspective as somebody that they're going to report to, going to work for. But still, it shows a great deal of trust that Sean Payton was willing to have them in those meetings, and it speaks to what he thinks of them.
Well, of course, General Manager George Paton also talked today. Aric, what did you really just learn from him in his press conference?
Yeah, a little more the nuts and bolts from George Paton today. Got some injury updates. Tim Patrick expected to be 100% for this coming season. Javonte Williams sounds like right now is on track to start the year, to be ready to go in week 1. And then Randy Gregory should be healthy for the offseason program. So for an injury standpoint, that stood out. And then free agent-wise, it sounds like George Paton has had very positive conversations with Draymond Jones's representatives. And then he said Alex Singleton, he's a guy we really want back here in Denver. So, Broncos have a lot of guys that'll become unrestricted free agents here in just a few weeks. They have that exclusive negotiating window right now. But those were kind of 2 of the guys that got mentioned as key players.
George also talked about the depth in later rounds in this year's draft and just maybe the potential to acquire more picks. Aric, as you know, the road to the draft starts here this week in Indy at the Combine. So what do you think the staff's biggest focus will be really this week.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. George said, and I think every GM kind of views their pick as the sweet spot, but I think the George thinks that there's talent available when the Broncos make those first picks, if they don't trade back, of course, or trade up at 67 and 68. Thinks they can get 2 good football players there. He's done that in the past, in the third round. Gotten some good players, but I think the goal this week is just to get to know these guys. They'll have formal interviews, they'll have informal interviews, they'll get to watch them work out, and I think a big part of it too is understanding what does Sean Payton want from a football player and making sure that you're getting guys that are going to fit in that system for him on offense, in that Vance Joseph defensive system. Those are all things that you work over time, and George Payton said you never stop learning kind of how to figure out which guys belong in which systems, but you want to get to a point where your scouts can say that's a future Denver Bronco, and that starts this week.
Yep. Well, looking forward to it. Appreciate you joining the show, Aric. We will be here, of course, the next couple days, so make sure to stay up to date on all of our content on denverbroncos.com and all of the Denver Broncos social media channels. Well, that'll do it for today's episode of Broncos Now, Broncos Country. Thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure to follow the Denver Broncos Podcast Network on Twitter and the Denver Broncos YouTube channel to stay up to date on all the latest episodes. I'll see you guys next time.